One warm afternoon, Imam Hasan alayhi salam was walking through a beautiful garden. The trees stood tall, the branches were heavy with ripe fruit. Bright flowers bloomed in every corner, filling the air with a fresh, sweet scent. It was a beautiful, peaceful garden. Imam Hasan alayhi salam was the beloved grandson of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was known for his kindness and generosity and his great love for all of Allah's creation. People loved him, they admired him, not just because he was from the Prophet's family, but because of his gentle heart and noble character. Today, as Imam Hassan walked along the garden path, something unusual caught his eye. Under the shade of a large tree, there was a young servant sitting on the grass, eating his simple meal. But he wasn't eating alone. There was a small, hungry looking dog sitting right beside him. This man only had a small loaf of bread in his hand. But instead of keeping it all to himself, he was tearing off a piece and placing it gently in front of the dog. Then he would take a bite for himself. He was repeating this over and over again, one piece for himself and one piece for the dog. Imam Hassan watched with curiosity. This young man seemed to have such a small meal, yet he was sharing without hesitation. He walked closer to the young servant and greeted him with salam and asked, "Why are you sharing your food with this dog?" The servant looked up with a kind smile. "This is all I have for lunch," he said, holding up his small piece of bread. "But when I saw this dog watching me, I couldn't just eat all by myself while he was hungry. He has no one to take care of him." Imam Hassan looked around at the trees full of fruit and asked, "But why don't you take some fruit from the garden to eat?" The servant shook his head. "This garden does not belong to me," he said. "I'm just a servant. The trees and their fruit belong to my master, and it would not be right for me to take from them without his permission." Imam Hassan smiled, his heart touched by the servant's honesty and kindness. He wanted to reward such a kind and honest young man. So he turned to the servant and asked, "Who owns this garden?" The young man lowered his gaze and respectfully told him his master's name. Imam Hassan nodded thoughtfully. "Where can I find your master?" The young man gave him directions, and without hesitation, Imam Hassan left the garden. He was determined to find the owner of this garden himself. As he walked through the town, the streets buzzed with life. Merchants stood by their stalls, calling out to passers-by. Fresh honey, sweet dates, and the finest figs covered their stalls. The scent of warm bread and roasting spices filled the air, and people heard about bartering and chatting. But Imam Hassan paid no attention to the noise around him. His mind was set on one thing, finding the garden's owner and doing something special for this kind-hearted servant he had just met. He finally arrived at the house of the wealthy garden owner. The big wooden door stood tall, and when he knocked, the owner came out to greet him. Imam Hassan greeted him and immediately asked about buying the garden. The owner was so surprised and thought for a moment, but he gave him a price. And without any hesitation, Imam Hassan agreed and paid the full amount for the garden. Then he did something unexpected. He asked about the young servant who worked there. The owner paused, and then he named another price. This was the price for the servant, to set the servant free. Once again, Imam Hassan paid the full price. Now, with everything settled, Imam Hassan turned and made his way back. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The streets were still busy, with shopkeepers closing their stalls. But Imam Hassan had only one thought, returning to the garden to see the young man who he had met earlier. When he finally arrived at the garden again, the young man saw Imam Hassan return, and he quickly stood up out of respect. But before he could say anything, Imam Hassan smiled and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are free," he said. The young man froze. Had he heard that correctly? His heart pounded. Imam Hasan continued, "You no longer belong to anyone. You are no longer a servant. From this moment on, you are a free man." The young man stood still. He was unable to find words. He had worked hard all his life, never daring to dream of anything different. But now, for the first time ever, he was free. Free to live his own life. Just when he thought the moment couldn't get any better, Imam Hassan spoke again. "The garden is now yours." The young man's eyes widened. His? He looked around at the trees he had just watered, the plants he had cared for, and the soft earth beneath his feet. This land, where he had once worked as a servant, now belonged to him. He smiled at Imam Hassan and thanked him, and said, "This garden has always given me shelter, and now it has given me freedom. I will make sure that this garden helps others too." And so, his garden became a place of kindness. Anyone who was hungry was welcome to take some fruit. People and animals alike, they were cared for, and no one was turned away. Even though his title had changed, his heart remained the same. He truly had always been rich in kindness and in having a big heart. The end. So, what can we learn from this story? Well, being kind doesn't just mean helping people. It means taking care of everything Allah created. Animals, birds, plants, even the tiniest insects and bugs. They may not speak our language, but they have their own way of praying to Allah. When you leave water outside, a thirsty bird drinks and makes dua. When you care for a plant, it grows strong and makes dua for the person who takes care of it. Even a tiny ant carrying its food is part of Allah's creation. And when you show kindness to all these creatures, they pray to their creator for you. And the best part is, Allah listens to their duas and blesses you even more. So this Ramadan, let's make a habit of caring for all of Allah's creation. Feed an animal, water a plant, look after your pets. Because when you do, Allah will reward you in ways that you cannot even imagine.